Call this meeting back to order. So next we have the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. Appearing is Ms. Susan O'Donnell. We'll continue in the same format as we had before. Ms. O'Donnell will allow 20 minutes for a presentation, followed by 12 minutes per party for questions, beginning with the opposition and government, followed by the Green Party. Couple minutes for closing remarks, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Susan O'Donnell, and I represent the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. Our coalition has 10 members in the core organizing group. There's 8 environmental organizations, the Council of Canadians Fredericton Chapter, the Council of Canadians St. John Chapter, Leap Forward St. John, Concerned Citizens of St. John, Sustainable Energy Group Carleton County, Extinction Rebellion New Brunswick, New Brunswick Anti-Shale Gas Alliance, Sierra Club Canada Foundation Atlantic Chapter, and then there's 2 university projects. The Plutonium Project at St. Thomas University. In my speaking notes it says Environment and Society. It should say the Plutonium Project at St. Thomas University and the Raven Project at the University of New Brunswick. And then on our website, they're the names of 15 other organizations and businesses and more than 120 people across New Brunswick who support our work. Our mission is to advocate for responsible energy development in New Brunswick to address the climate crisis using these 4 guidelines: to reduce energy demand by eliminating energy waste and maximizing energy efficiency, to eliminate the development of fossil fuel energy and phase out nuclear energy, to increase the percentage of electricity generated by renewable energy with storage in New Brunswick, and to support solidarity actions with communities experiencing the harmful impacts of our energy choices in New Brunswick, across Canada, and globally. In our coalition, I represent the Raven Project at the University of New Brunswick, where I'm an adjunct professor and social science researcher with expertise in technology adoption. Our coalition has taken an active interest in the SMR projects in New Brunswick. In July last year, we applied to the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change to designate the ARC and the Moltex projects for a federal impact assessment. Our application is 75 pages and it outlines the concerns that we have about these SMR projects, and we'd encourage all of you to access the application on our website to understand all our concerns. We received letters of support by 3 Indigenous organizations in New Brunswick and 15 environmental and health organizations, and then the Minister received 300 letters from the public, the vast majority in support, and our application has been downloaded more than 800 times from our website. In December, the Minister denied our request. However, we achieved our main objective: to bring wider public attention to the risks of these SMR projects. And that's why I'm here today, to bring public attention to the risks of developing SMRs in New Brunswick and to discuss them with you. So the New Brunswick government gave these 2 startups, ARC and Moltex, $30 million, and the federal government gave Moltex $50.5 million. We've looked for and we've been unable to find any evidence that these SMR project proposals underwent a successful independent scientific assessment before they were funded. Our coalition has only one recommendation for this committee: that you base your decision about supporting SMRs or not on the best scientific analysis conducted by independent experts with no conflict of interest who are not funded by the nuclear industry. In my presentation, I will share some findings from the best available independent scientific analysis of SMRs. So what are advanced reactors? The ARC and Moltex designs are called advanced, but that only means that they're very different from all other nuclear power reactors in commercial operation. Most of the large nuclear power reactors operating across the world are what's called light water reactors. In the US, for example, They're all light water reactors. They're cooled with ordinary water, and they use uranium fuel that's enriched at a low level. In Canada, all the nuclear power reactors are CANDUs. They're cooled with heavy water. It's water containing extra neutrons, and that makes it heavier. And they're fueled with natural uranium. NB Power chose two advanced reactor designs that are not cooled by water. The ARC 100 design is cooled by liquid sodium metal, and the Moltex design is cooled by molten salt. Neither of these two reactor designs have ever operated successfully in a commercial setting, and that's the key word, commercial. ARC and Moltex are assuming that there will be a market for a sodium-cooled SMR and a molten salt SMR. That's a big assumption that customers exist for these kinds of SMRs, except maybe the Port of Belledune. The two designs will require different kinds of fuel. The ARC design is for an enriched uranium fuel called HALEU, and the Moltex design calls for a plutonium-based fuel. Enriched fuel means that there's more of the kind of uranium in it that can make nuclear explosions. HALEU fuel is more enriched but considered safe for commercial power reactors. Global nuclear fuel supply chains have been developed for light water reactors. In Canada, the nuclear fuel supply is geared toward CANDUs, but there's no fuel supply chain existing for advanced reactors. ARC says its SMR design is based on the second experimental breeder reactor, the EBR-2, which was a sodium-cooled reactor that operated in a laboratory for 30 years. It's a big leap, a giant technical leap from a laboratory reactor to a reactor that generates power successfully in a commercial setting. Many technologies work in a laboratory but fail in a commercial environment, in part because the supply chains do not exist to support them. You may be thinking, great, that's exactly what we want to do, build a global business network to support these advanced reactors. But as I will explain, expert analysis found that the fact that it doesn't exist yet creates a significant challenge to their commercial success. So what is the best available science on advanced reactors? Both ARC and Moltex have operations in the US. Similar to the presentations they're making to this committee, ARC and Moltex each presented to a committee of 16 senior nuclear experts for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in Washington. The National Academy's report on advanced reactor fuel and waste was published a few months ago in November. The 330-page report includes analysis of molten salt and sodium-cooled reactors and comments on the ARC 100 and the Moltex SMR designs. The report was a consensus of the 16 nuclear experts and was peer-reviewed by a different set of 13 nuclear experts, coordinated by a retired senior scientist and a university president emeritus. You could not get a better gold standard of scientific review. So first, let's talk about the timelines for developing SMRs. One of our coalition's primary concerns is that SMRs will take far too long to develop to be included in a climate action plan that must deliver results within the next decade. The experts say the types of reactors not cooled by water will take much longer than a decade to commercialize, and I'll quote from the report. Most of the advanced reactors, especially the non-light water reactors, will confront significant challenges in meeting commercial deployment by 2050. One reason for the lengthy time is the need for comprehensive prototyping. I mentioned the giant leap between a laboratory and a commercial setting. According to the experts, there will be significant delays demonstrating the basic strength and performance of materials when subjected to new coolants, temperatures, and pressures because of a lack of adequate capabilities to develop, test, and qualify advanced fuels and materials. The experts say that for advanced reactors to be commercially successful, a significant challenge will be developing a new fuel supply chain. The global fuel supply geared for light water reactors took many decades to develop. It cannot be replicated quickly and will only be developed if SMRs are cost competitive and have a future. Right at the start, it will be a challenge to source the HALEU fuel required for the ARC SMR design. The only supply of this fuel is in Russia, and sanctions will likely make that Russian fuel unavailable in future. The U.S. has no capacity to manufacture HALEU fuel, although it is planning to ramp up to manufacture HALEU to supply the SMRs being developed in the U.S. It is unknown if HALEU will be available to reactor projects in Canada in the coming decades. The Moltex SMR design proposes to make its own fuel from used CANDU fuel using a reprocessing technology called pyroprocessing, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. For timelines, the expert report notes a significant drawback. It's a batch process, which makes scale-up difficult. One expert committee member previously assessed the only industrial-scale experience in the world with the pyroprocessing method proposed by Moltex. The original timeline for that pyroprocessing project had to be extended. It will take many decades, 30 times longer than originally planned. And what about the costs of SMRs? Our coalition is concerned about the costs of building SMRs and the impact on electricity rates. The expert report states that the costs of advanced reactors and their associated new fuel cycles, just at the pilot reactor scale, would be at least several $billion for non-light water advanced reactors like ARC and Moltex. These costs would rise to hundreds of billions of dollars for full deployment of an alternative fuel cycle that would replace the arrangements that exist globally for light water reactors. I'll just stress now that the 16 experts on the study panel are nuclear industry consultants, senior scientists, and professors with long careers working with and analyzing nuclear reactors and fuel cycles in laboratory and commercial environments. In their consensus report, these experts state that, and I quote, "Implementing just a few of the most promising reactor concepts and their associated fuel cycles at a large commercial scale would require substantial government and industry investments well beyond 2050. Now, what about radioactive waste? Our coalition believes the nuclear industry has no social license to produce more toxic radioactive wastes that must be kept isolated from all life forms for millennia. There's no permanent facility to store high-level radioactive waste in Canada. It's all in temporary storage. Local residents and Indigenous nations oppose plans to site a deep geological repository in Ontario and to transport waste from other provinces into Ontario. The metallic sodium coolant in the ARC 100 design reacts violently with water or air, posing a serious fire hazard. Accidents have occurred at the site of previous attempts to commercialize sodium-cooled reactors in the US, in France, in Japan, and Scotland. The expert report states that liquid sodium metal reactors like the ARC 100 design would produce large volumes of spent fuel waste that's bonded with sodium, and decommissioning waste that would require treatment by methods not yet technically mature at the industrial scale. Molten salt reactors like the Moltex SMR design would produce multiple waste streams, not only from the reactor, but also from the Watts process that has to operate in order to produce the initial load of fuel for the reactor. Because of the chemical and physical properties of salts used in Moltex, these wastes would require processing before disposal. These treatment methods are in early stages of exploration, and the experts do not know yet how these new kinds of radioactive waste can be handled and managed. But what about high-level waste recycling? Moltex claims that its technology can use up nuclear waste. The expert committee analyzed the type of reprocessing, pyroprocessing, proposed by Moltex, as well as other methods, because Moltex is not the only company claiming it can reduce and recycle nuclear waste. The expert found that these claims had little merit because the long-lived harmful products cannot be neatly removed from the used fuel. They concluded that, quote, "The introduction and use of advanced reactors and small modular reactors in and of themselves will do little, if anything, to eliminate the need to manage and dispose of nuclear waste." Moltex itself acknowledges that less than 1% of the CANDU spent fuel could potentially be reused as fuel in its SMR, leaving more than 99% in the form of many new radioactive waste streams to deal with. What about nuclear weapons proliferation? Our coalition also believes there is no social license in Canada to support technologies intended for export that may increase the risk of developing nuclear weapons in other countries. Experts agree that reprocessing nuclear waste to extract the plutonium introduces the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation. Canada imposed an informal ban on reprocessing in the 1970s. The government is considering allowing reprocessing as part of the new radioactive waste management policy that's expected later this year. But civil society groups are campaigning for a permanent ban. The expert report notes that Moltex continues to claim that the main output of its pyroprocessing would be useless in weapons. In contrast, however, the experts say, and I quote, "While these technologies may provide some benefit in delaying direct use of the materials, there was consensus among the committee members that none provided significant proliferation resistance at this time." In addition, the expert report states that the HALEU fuel that the ARC-100 design requires is enriched to a higher level than the fuel used by light water reactors, and so expanding the global use of HALEU fuel would potentially worsen weapons proliferation and security risks. So to conclude, the experts say that advanced non-light water reactors will have difficulty reaching commercialization by 2050. This contrasts with ARC's claim that its reactor will be ready by 2030 and the Moltex target of the mid-2030s. How can this disparity be explained? Moltex claims that its technology can reduce the radioactive waste problem at Point Lepreau. How can they defend this claim when the expert report says the opposite? Moltex also claims that its technology will not increase the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation, but again, the expert report says the opposite. How can this be explained? The expert report raises questions about the large volumes of radioactive sodium waste that the ARC-100 design would create and the waste the Moltex design would create, for which no industrial level management methods exist. Who will answer these questions? The expert report states that the cost of building pilot reactors for non-light water designs will be at least several $billion. Further, it will cost hundreds of billions of dollars to develop an entire nuclear fuel supply infrastructure to service non-light water reactors. Supporting these efforts will continue to require significant public funds well beyond 2050. At the same time, NB Power, the New Brunswick government, ARC, and Moltex have not revealed the cost of their SMR plans. Why have they remained silent? Thank you for your attention. I look forward to discussing these issues with you and will do my best to answer your questions. Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. O'Donnell, for that presentation. And we'll move straight forward into questions from members, beginning with the opposition. Who would like to go first? Mr. Lepage, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for being here and with this elaborated presentation. But I'd like to know a little bit more about the committee that you refer to a lot
Yes,
in your presentation.
absolutely, yeah.
Is that the only committee or source of information that you are delivering to us today, or is it based on other scientific proof?
There's one other paper that I referenced in there, written by a committee member. I think I can tell you what page it's on. It's in the footnotes. All of the other references are from the committee, and there's one paper that was written about 5 years ago from one of the committee members that gives more information on the Moltex project. But I can tell you that this information didn't come out of the blue for us. I mean, a lot of this information is available in other reports that have been published over the years. So it wasn't a complete surprise to see any of the information in the report. And if you go to the report itself, it references many of these previous reports that have been published on these subjects.
So what year was the latest report that you're considering, you're giving us some details about?
This report that I'm quoting from and that all of the information I'm basing it on was November 2022, so 4 months ago. Yeah.
All right. So thank you very much for that little explanation.
Okay, and I'll just say that on the website we weren't allowed to give URLs, but on the website for that, it has the biographies, the CVs of every member of the committee, which I have read, and I can tell you that they're all very experienced nuclear scientists and researchers, yeah.
This is a condensed report, I presume, but what would be your coalition's, if you could identify 3 barriers to produce SMRs in New Brunswick, what would you do? What would they be?
Well, I mean, I suppose if either of these projects got $2 billion, they could maybe build something. I guess the question is, are they intended to be sold elsewhere? And what could possibly come from that? I'd say the biggest barrier is going to be getting the money, especially because of the aspect that I said, because they're advanced SMRs, and there's very little interest in advanced SMRs in the commercial world. So I would say that's the biggest barrier, the non-light water-cooled reactors. Your specific question was to getting them built in New Brunswick or to selling them around the world? I'm not sure what you're...
To have them operated here in New Brunswick.
Well, the problem is neither of those 2 types of reactors have ever operated successfully before. And I know, I'm sure that the 2 companies believe that their designs will be different from all the other attempts. And I don't know what to say about that. But all I can say is they don't have a good history in terms of attempts to move from the laboratory to the commercial environment. So I would say that the technical problems, as far as I understand them, are such that they're difficult to actually operate in a commercial environment successfully. I mentioned the sodium-cooled reactor and the fact that sodium metal is very volatile. And in fact, I think all the attempts to commercialize sodium-cooled reactors before, it's that specific problem. So there have been fires, there have been explosions, et cetera, and huge multi-billion projects have had to be abandoned. I see that you have Professor Ramana this afternoon. He's written extensively about this. You can certainly ask him the specifics. He would know a lot about that. The molten salt reactor, there's only been, I think there were 2 trials in a laboratory to operate in an aircraft or something, and then it was abandoned. They're extremely a difficult type of reactor to try and get off the ground. It's never come close to commercialization, the molten salt one. I don't think anyone's ever tried after those initial attempts.
Well, that's probably a business, from a business perspective, which I am not a scientific one. How can some scientific people be against new technologies and advancement in production of energy? And 2 groups will clash. And yeah. I find that being an MLA, how can I sell your arguments in plain language that our citizens of New Brunswick will understand without being too technical? And that's why I was asking for your 3 barriers, 3 simple words. What are you worried about SMRs in New Brunswick?
Okay, that's a different question than what's the barriers to business areas. Yeah, I would say that all of the groups in our coalition, our main worry is the climate crisis. That's our main worry. And so when we started investigating these SMRs and looking at the history of nuclear reactors and how long they take to build, and then when we started looking into it more, the fact that there's going to be such delays and serious questions about whether these reactors can actually build at all based on the attempts, the failed attempts before, that would be our main concern, is the length of time it would take to get these things built. And I think that New Brunswickers are not being presented with the alternatives. I mean, from what...
Okay, so what would be those alternatives then instead of SMRs?
Great question. Absolutely great question. I hope more people will ask it. You know, the very first webinar we did, was a presentation by Chris Rouse, who I hope you'll get to talk to sometimes, who's laid out a whole plan for an alternative renewable energy future for New Brunswick, using the capabilities that we have right now and how we work with the carbon tax rebates, et cetera, to invest in renewable energy. This is what you should, excuse me, I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but I would love to hear NB Power answer that question. What's Plan B?
NB Power is on the
Yes,
list too, but
yeah.
I'm asking you, what would be your alternatives today that you would suggest to us?
I would suggest to look at renewable energy with storage and to find out from NB Power, instead of just having a SMR group to push and to look at SMRs, they should have a renewable group and present us with some alternatives so that we can actually discuss something. I mean, what you're asking me as a, basically as a volunteer, and all of us as volunteers, is, come up with a plan for New Brunswick. I would say that's New Brunswick Power's plan, but I'm telling you it's alternative. The alternative is renewable energy with storage technologies. I mean, we talk about alternative or renewables being intermittent. Look at our La Pro plant. That has so many unplanned intermittent breakdowns. And when that happens, we have to immediately divert to fossil fuel. We fire up Coulson Cove, and so the thing with renewables and the advantage of renewables is we know sometimes the wind doesn't blow, we know sometimes the sun doesn't shine, and so you plan the whole system so you have storage attached to it. That's how they're built. You don't just build them on their own. It's the La Pro plants, it's these untested technologies that we're worried about. Why would we have a climate plan built on a technology where the centerpiece is a technology that's not even built yet? It makes no sense to us, and that's what we're concerned about.
I don't have any more questions yet, but I know that my colleague here does, so.
Yeah,
Give him
thank
the-
you very much, Gilles. Yeah, I might have time for just two questions. Are there any examples out there where, is there a country leading the charge when, creating electricity by reducing their fossil fuels and actually phasing out nuclear? Like, is there an example that we can,
Well, I mean,
Look to-
the best example is right next door in Quebec. They had the sister reactor to the La Pro reactor, the Gentilly 2, and they shut that down 10 years ago. And they're absolutely committed to not restarting on nuclear. And they're actually building out more renewables. Of course, they've got those wonderful hydro resources, I mean, you can't beat that. They're a hydro powerhouse. But when you look at what they're building now, they're building out new renewables.
okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your presentation that obviously you're worried about the timeline for the SMRs.
Yes.
Are there different technologies being developed that might actually outpace or maybe come to fruition before actually the technology from the SMRs?
Well, we have technologies right now. I mean, of course, we're always getting better wind turbines and, better solar panels, et cetera, but these technologies exist now. And another of our concerns is, in the decade or the 2 decades or the 3 decades that it takes for, to see if this SMR is going to work, we're wasting all that time. We could be putting up, just say, for example, an offshore wind farm like they're doing in New England, just south of us. We could build that out in less than 10 years. And so that's the problem, is that we could be generating right now, or within 10 years, non-renewable energy when, while we're waiting for these to be built. So the technologies exist. Of course, they're getting better all the time. But yeah, I mean, we could just do it.
You think there'd be social acceptance for like big wind parks? Like even offshore, like a few years ago, so I'm up in Tracadie, so a few years ago, a company came up to Tracadie and they wanted to install an offshore wind park. And there was a lot of concerns because it's where lobster fishing is done.
Yeah.
And I don't think they would have got social acceptance, and obviously we saw what happened also in Carricket or
That's a great question, and I would encourage you, I know Louise Como from the Conservation Council is speaking tomorrow, and she's done work on social acceptance, so she could speak more authoritatively on that, but I will tell you, as far as offshore wind farms, that interestingly enough, for example, they found that because of what happens, the ecosystem that actually develops around the base for those offshore wind farms, it creates new, I'm not sure exactly, but new environments that actually attracts fish. I don't know about lobster. Yeah. I also know that the Audubon Society, for example, which is the big bird protection organization, now is actually okaying, they're giving the stamp of approval to wind farms because the technology, again, has developed such that it's not considered a problem for migratory birds, for example.
Okay, thanks. My time is up.
Okay.
Minister Holland, you have some questions?
Donald, how are you today? I wanted to go through a couple of things. My first two questions were kind of answered as a result of my colleagues over there. We're working just hand in glove again. That's amazing. But what I was hearing was a conversation around renewables. And so my question was going to be around the firm source of power to back up the renewables. And what you'd indicated was that we need to act now with renewables, with storage. Mm-hmm. But storage for renewables is as far out on a trajectory on a cost-effective basis as SMRs. So what you're talking about doing is something that is unrealistic for the current day and age. If we turned around tomorrow, I guess if you said stop working on the SMR file, mm-hmm. start working on the renewable file, what would you suggest as the backup for firm power? If storage is not a viable factor right now, or a cost-effective.
Okay. Well, sorry. Yeah. And again, there's other experts who are going to be speaking to you that I would suggest you ask. But I can tell you, for example, I read recently a paper by Professor Romana, who's going to be speaking this afternoon, who actually looked at, for example, Ontario's plans to build new nuclear versus renewables, and including storage. And absolutely agree with you that the technology is very expensive right now for storage, but the costs are dropping rapidly. At the same time that the costs are dropping rapidly for solar and wind, they're also dropping for storage. And there's huge, huge innovation going on right now with storage. So that would be a question for him and his paper in terms of, he'd actually, as I said, costed it out for
So the first of a kind on SMRs would have a higher price tag than the nth of a kind. Probably not unlike storage as it relates to renewables, but if we're working on a trajectory that's similar, and as we get out to that end game and the nth of a kind on an SMR is going to be cheaper than the first of a kind on storage, why wouldn't we go down both tracks simultaneously?
Well, Minister, you're assuming there will be an nth of a kind.
Well, you're assuming there won't. I mean, we're talking about, I noticed a couple of times we had heard questions about, unscientific statements about feeling or perception or assumption. And we got to deal they both be on a level playing field of projected and hopeful, so to speak, but for you to talk definitively about arriving at storage, but undefinitively about arriving at SMRs is an unfair scientific comparison, wouldn't you say?
That's an interesting statement. I would say that the storage technologies exist now. They're just expensive, and they need to get better.
And I would say that we've got thousands of megawatts of SMR sodium-driven technology that exists now.
No, there's no.
And potentially might be expensive.
I'd just like to clarify that. There's none in commercial operation.
So let's back that up, because that was where I was going to go next. You
Yeah.
talked about no proven commercial application.
Yeah.
Fair enough. That presupposes that there will be no market available or interested in that. And so are you saying that there isn't significant activity within the investment world as it relates to putting money into SMRs, as it relates to the potential to recover that investments through SMRs feeding the need to decarbonize the industrial sector?
Well, that's interesting. Again, you know, that specific question, I'd say, would be good for Professor Romana, because he has looked at
Okay.
costs. But I will say that, as it happens, I was just talking to one of my nephews the other day who just got a new job with a large commercial German investment company, and they're not going to touch nuclear because it's such a bad investment, including SMRs.
I think using the context of the German political environment and the commerce situation
No, I
in
asked
Germany
him
would
I asked him
be
about
important
that.
to have for context there when you consider the
They
makeup of their very
unfortunately
legislature.
invest in fossil fuel projects,
Yeah.
but not nuclear. Yeah.
So in that implication is that the technology doesn't work when you say there's no commercial application. But when we talk about particularly the ARC 100 unit, we've got a unit that did work at 20 megawatts, and we're processing through a scale-up to 100 megawatts up to 200 megawatts with the proven technology to withstand a catastrophic failure situation, and as a result produce emission-free generation of electricity. So I've heard a lot of comments about unsafe, unproven, unknown, but when we've got that track record to fall back on, in that case study right there, how can we use adjectives like unproven, unknown, unsafe when we have examples of a controlled shutdown that didn't result in catastrophic failure, and the proof of a 20 megawatt operating unit that is actually generating, notwithstanding potentially not applied to the commercial setting or the industrial sector. But when I hear adjectives used like unknown, unproven, unsafe, I find that a little disingenuous, because we have a case study where it actually happened from 1963 to 1994.
Okay, fair question. But just to clarify, I never used the word unsafe.
Well,
Yeah, I never used that word. I don't know enough about.
in your section that discussed about the dangers of nuclear fuel and whatnot, I mean, that was
No,
inferred.
I don't think I used the word unsafe. Anyway.
To question and answer.
What
One
I'll
person speaking at a
I'll
time.
just talk more about the EBR2. Thanks for bringing that up. So there's a couple of things. You mentioned that it was a smaller unit. It did operate in a laboratory setting. I mentioned the huge leap to a commercial environment where there's certain tests that have to happen that haven't happened yet with this unit. I'm just going, you know, a lot of my knowledge is going on the expert report and previous reports that they're partly basing their information on. There's one key thing, and I think you might have picked it up in my presentation. A lot of this is about the fuel. Now, the fuel that the EBR2 used was enriched to 65%. That is close to weapons-grade fuel. And it's a lot easier to make a reactor that has fuel that's enriched to 65%. And that's why, for example, you can have nuclear reactors operating on submarines that are small, because they're in military contexts. And that kind of fuel has to be guarded in a military context. You can't have more than 20% enrichment in a civilian context, or else it gets very, very dangerous. And so the EBR2 operated on 65% fuel. So to scale that down, it's not just that they have to make it, you know, a bigger reactor and meet all the different tests and find the supply for that HALEU fuel, now that Russia doesn't supply it anymore, but they have to try and make the reactor work with a much lower enrichment of fuel. And that's not a trivial task. That's a big task. So I would just say that again, you know, it's a huge leap between a laboratory reactor and a commercial reactor, and that's all I can say, except to back that up with what the experts say, that it's going to take a long time to meet commercial deployment.
I think we are going to be looking at long-term to get storage. We've got a runway in front of us where we have to, it's got to be both and, not either or. All sources of opportunity to go emission-free are very important. But, so regardless of the grade of plutonium that we were talking about, you've got a situation where the discussion around the weaponization, you know, there's questions about the grade, what's available, what's easier to weaponize. But we just heard testimony this morning that based on the composition of the spent fuel after the 20-year cycle, that you would have to have your own nuclear facility to re-energize it, to bring it to any particular point of weaponization, which is probably not a high likelihood for anybody with those nefarious motivations. So if we talk about the grade and being more likely, but the process is going to prohibit it, from what we heard there this morning, does that not offer us some level of comfort that we aren't dealing with somebody cooking dirty bombs out of a warehouse in some foreign country?
Well, I have to say I'm pleased that you're concerned with the, you know, weaponization aspects of this. I think we're talking about two different things. There's the fuel, which is the HALEU,
Yep.
which is the highly enriched. That's one thing. But I think what you said just there is what happens to the used fuel. Is that what
Yes.
you're saying?
Yes.
After it's, okay. So it's interesting because ARC has said that in the presentation this morning that once their used fuel comes out, they intend it to go eventually in a deep geological repository. There is the possibility, and that's usually why people build sodium-cooled fast reactors, is to actually recycle the fuel, get the plutonium out, and do it again. What this expert report says is there's always concerns about nuclear weapons proliferation when you do that. Of course, there are safeguards. There's the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's all kinds of safeguards. What I'm just saying is that this potential exists, and it doesn't exist with CANDU reactors, right? Because we use natural uranium. That's the whole
Different fuel.
point. Yeah. So it'd just be introducing a new risk to New Brunswick, that's all.
Perfect. I just have one more question that I wanted to finish off with. And we talked about the German economy not being interested in the SMRs. I can barely handle the New Brunswick economy and focused on the Canadian economy. And that's quite frankly where I want to see moves made towards environmental responsibility. And when you are faced with conversations where we look at the oil sands, where 30% of the emissions from the oil sands come from extracting product from the oil sands, and we've got something that would need a firmly backed form of electricity to replace, and we have the opportunity to move forward. Renewables won't give us the options that we need to provide that industrial application for the oil sands. So when I hear you question the viability of the industrial sector or the commercialization, whereas we have an entire western part of the country that could benefit from this, what basis do you say that there is no market or there's no option or no opportunity to decarbonize, particularly with the regulations that are going to be imposed on the fossil fuel industry here in the country?
Okay, I'll say two things quickly about that. I haven't seen that. It's a bit of a interesting one that to save carbon, you build a technology to extract more carbon from the ground. That's one kind of thing that, you know. But I would say that if Alberta says it wants to buy one of your ARC or Moltex products, then I guess you're correct.
There's more than one available for purchasing.
It hasn't been built yet, and from everything that...
Would mean that there's a significant opportunity for megawatts, whether it be for the replacement of electricity through
Minister,
coal or
Thank you,
industrial
Mr.
use.
Minister.
there's all
your
kinds
time
of
is-
needs in the world. It doesn't mean that they can be
We're
met.
at time, thank you.
Yeah. That was fun.
So we're going to have to move along here. Ms. Mitten, do you have some questions?
I do indeed. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I want to start by just going back to something that was in your presentation. And so this was from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, published in 2022, Merits and Viability of Different Nuclear Fuel Cycles and Technology Options and the Waste Aspects of Advanced Nuclear Reactors, from the National Academies Press. And so that was with the 16 experts. And so some of the quotes in your presentation included, and I'm quoting, "Most of the advanced reactors, especially the non-light water reactors, will confront significant challenges in meeting commercial deployment by 2050. And another quote, "Implementing just a few of the most promising reactor concepts and their associated fuel cycles at a large commercial scale would require substantial government and industry investments well beyond 2050. So I guess I wanted to just ask about the timelines and connect it back to something else you'd mentioned in your presentation regarding energy needs when it relates to the timelines required for climate change. I'm wondering if you can elaborate more on that.
Thank you. Well, if you as I assume this committee has seen the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, we need to be moving quickly, really quickly. And in fact, the head of the UN Secretary General said last year that it's morally wrong to think about having more fossil fuel infrastructure, for example. So all of that is going to have to be wound down, and we're just going to have to make some choices. And it has to happen quickly, or we're basically going to be making life very, very difficult for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren and future generations. I think that's really clear. And so they say that we have to be turning the corner in 5 years, actually, to make a livable planet for humans. And so that's why we're so focused, our coalition is so focused on getting things ramped up now in New Brunswick and not waiting for technologies that have not been proven yet, that don't actually exist in a commercial setting. We can't use them yet. I mean, we're far, far, far from a license for either the ARC or the Moltex. They can't build them now. We have lots of technologies that we can build now because they are licensed to build. They can go ahead and build them. So we need to be doing this now. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but it's really clear. And all of the reports by the UN, of course, of which Canada subscribes to, says that we need to be doing this now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so I appreciate you elaborating on the timeline for climate, for implementing energy, for really changing our trajectory quickly, and that these technologies that we're examining, so they're not proven in a commercial setting, and that these experts are suggesting it could be, we're looking at quite a long timeline to looking at, they're the ones mentioning 2050 in their report. And in terms of fuel, I wanted to ask, you had, and this came up in the earlier presentation, talking about the HALEU fuel, and so there's the mention of the, nuclear weapons concerns, as well as when it comes to the plutonium aspect. But I was wondering if you, and if we should ask another expert, we can do that, but if you can speak to the supply chain.
Yes.
You spoke about Russia in here. Can you speak to the supply chain?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So anything above 20% is risk of nuclear weapons proliferation. And 90% and above is weapons grade. And as I mentioned, the EBR2 was in the 65%. So below 20%, it's generally accepted that you can use that in commercial power reactors. The space between 10 and 20% is called HALEU fuel. And at the moment, the only reason that it's only available in Russia is because they use that for their nuclear reactors. And they supply it and they make it. And so right now, we only have, like, the whole global supply chain is for low enriched uranium. In Canada, we don't need that. We have natural uranium. But there's only a few plants around the world that make enriched uranium. I just want to say something about uranium enrichment. It's very, very expensive. An enrichment plant costs billions and billions of dollars to make. That's why we don't have one well, we don't need one in Canada, but that's why there aren't more of them. And one plant uses up the amount of electricity as a small city, possibly as much as Fredericton, because of the process to make it is just so complex. It actually takes some of the types of uranium out. It doesn't actually add more uranium in it. It takes some out, and it has to go through. It's just very, very expensive and time-consuming, and so it's expensive. And so the fuel itself, the higher the enrichment is, the more expensive the fuel is. And as I said, we don't have, and this is what it's clear in the report, we don't have a supply chain for HALEU fuel. You get it in Russia or you don't get it. And, you know, what the presenters from ARC were saying about how they're going to get, you know, that was news to me. That's interesting. You have to send it here and then get more enrichment here, get more enrichment here, because there's plants that can do it here and stuff. That might be for one reactor. But we don't have that for all the reactors. And in the report, it says that they're ramping up the HALEU production in the US, because they don't do it now. But that's going to take, like, the guts of a decade to ramp up production of HALEU fuel. And they'll only have enough for the reactors that are being kind of built there right now. And so if we're talking about a commercial production, we don't have that. I mean, we might have enough reactors to do the one-of-a-kind, or enough fuel to fuel the one-of-a-kind, et cetera, with HALEU, but nowhere near, you know, the commercial, if you're going to deploy these reactors all over, if you can indeed build them in the first place. So that's what they're talking about in this report, to actually ramp up a fuel supply chain to supply that kind of fuel for, you know, let's say you wanted to sell 10 of them or something. There isn't enough fuel to do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for elaborating on that. It also came up in the presentation earlier about sending, you know, the spent fuel, sending waste to Ontario. My understanding is that there's not actually a place for it to go yet. There's, you know, maybe there's an organization that's working on that. Can you speak to that
Sure.
in terms of what's happening in Ontario?
Yes, sure. Okay, so the organization is the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and NB Power pays $5 million a year to be part of that organization. And what they're doing is finding a place in Ontario to build a deep geological repository. And most of the money, they have a budget of something like $100 million a year. Most of that money goes into paying communities to try and convince them to build a deep geological repository in their environment. So there's 2 sites right now. There's one just off of Lake Huron that's actually is finding objection from the neighboring US states. That's near the Bruce Power Plant. And then there's one up in northern Ontario in a township close to the town of Ignace. And there's significant opposition to both of these proposals to build a deep geological repository. I mentioned Indigenous nations. The Assembly of First Nations in 2018 passed a resolution against SMRs specifically, and they do not want the waste from SMRs. I mean, it's, from their perspective, it's bad enough to be getting can-do waste, but these new kinds of waste that I've talked about, you know, the volatility of them, et cetera, they don't want them. And so they're very opposed to having these wastes in Ontario, and then specifically having waste come from outside of Ontario into Ontario to be disposed of on their traditional territories. So that's basically what's going on now. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has said that they're going to name one of the 2 sites that they've selected next year is the plan. and then we'll see what happens next. But I can tell you that the tradition has been, the U.S. has been trying for decades to get one of these built there, and they can't because of the opposition there. And this is what's happened in pretty well every country. There's actually one being built in Finland. It's not licensed yet, but that country did manage to get it through. But there's certainly nowhere in North America. And the only one that, you know, that the government is hoping to have happen will be in Ontario. But yeah, it doesn't exist yet.
Okay, thank you. And the clock is ticking here. I just wondered, you had mentioned a word I'm sure not a lot of people have really heard about, pyroprocessing.
Yes.
Would you be able to speak more to what it is you're referencing and why you brought it up?
Yeah, sure. Oh, so this is the process that Moltex is proposing to do to actually, with the CANDU spent fuel that's at La Pro, they're planning to, so right now when the fuel comes out of the CANDU reactors, it's in solid canisters. And what they're planning to do is basically melt these solid canisters in molten salt, turn that whole thing into a liquid, extract the plutonium, and use that as new fuel. The problem that the experts say is you can't neatly extract the plutonium, and so all of those other 99% of fuel waste that was solid and now is liquid is still going to be a problem, because there might be still the types of products in it that will be required to be kept isolated from all living things for hundreds of thousands of years. You can't neatly separate it, is what the experts are saying. And so, but that is the process. It's called pyroprocessing, and I referenced, and I have a paper in there of the only, study of the only experiment of the industrial level pyroprocessing. It's very difficult, very expensive, and it takes a lot longer than originally planned.
Okay, thank you. I believe my time has expired. Thank you.
Yes, that is time, but I wanted to thank you, Ms. O'Donnell, for being here today and presenting to us and answering some difficult questions. Certainly very informative. I'd like to offer the floor to you if you'd like to take a minute just for some closing remarks.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I wasn't prepared for this, but I will, since you gave me the opportunity. I'd just like to say I hope you're working on a Plan B, because from all the research that we've looked at, there's going to need to be a Plan B. And our fear actually is that you're going to stick with Plan A until 2029, when Beldoon has to close, and then say, oh, hey, it's not working. We're going to have to keep Beldoon open. And so I'm just saying right now that we think, and a lot of people think, and the experts think, it's not going to work by 2029, not by 2030, not by a long shot. And so you better work on your Plan B. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Ms. O'Donnell.